The wind was a blade, sharp and merciless against the exposed skin of her neck. It carried the stench of wet mud, unwashed bodies, and the cloying, bitter smoke from the forges. Marianne kept her eyes fixed on the splintered wood of the auction block beneath her bare feet, counting the cracks as if they were constellations that might guide her away from this moment. The iron chains on her wrists were a familiar cold, a constant reminder of what she was, property less than property. She was refuse, cast off and sold for whatever pittance could be salvaged from a life deemed worthless. The gasps and jeers of the crowd were a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. Her wolf, a phantom presence she hadn't truly felt in years, was a whimpering knot of shame deep within her soul. It offered no comfort, no surge of primal defiance. It was as broken as she was. They had been declared barren, the two halves of her whole, and the word was a death sentence. It was seared not only into her mind, but onto her flesh. The auctioneer, a corpulent man with sweat beading on his brow, despite the chill, grabbed her arm. He shoved her wrist forward for the crowd to see, his fingers digging cruelly into the swollen, weeping flesh around the brand. "See for yourselves," he boomed, his voice a gravelly parody of salesmanship. "Freshly marked by the Solcray elders, guaranteed barren, no risk of a tainted pup from this one. Good for labor, for service. Strong back, quiet mouth. What am I bid for this broken Omega?" Broken. The word echoed the pronouncement of her former alpha. It echoed the pitying whispers of the pack she-wolves, who clutched their own rounded bellies. It echoed in the vast, silent emptiness of her own womb. The brand on her wrist throbbed with a fiery, agonizing pain, a fresh wound that screamed her failure to the world. A crude, jagged symbol, an empty circle bisected by a harsh, straight line. The mark of an empty vessel. A handful of copper coins was tossed onto the stage, clattering with contemptuous finality. A leering alpha from a rogue clan raised a finger, his yellow eyes roaming her body with an owner's appraisal. He was likely buying her for sport, a thing to be used and discarded when he grew bored. Marianne's stomach clenched. This was the end. A slow, brutal fading into nothingness under the hand of a cruel master. She closed her eyes, praying for the moon to simply unmake her, to dissolve her into shadow and memory, then a change. It was not a sound, but the absence of it. The jeering laughter died in throats. The shuffling of feet on muddy ground ceased. The auctioneer's booming voice choked into a pathetic squeak. A silence so profound, so heavy, fell over the market square that Marianne could hear the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart. The air grew thick, charged with a power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The scent of the crowd was suddenly obliterated, replaced by something ancient and overwhelming. Pine needles crushed underfoot after a frost, the clean, cold scent of high mountain stone, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of old blood and a sorrow so deep it felt like winter itself. She did not need to look. Every wolf in the square knew that scent, though most had only heard of it in hushed, fearful whispers. It was the scent of the Alpha King. Marianne risked a glance, peering through the tangled curtain of her dark hair. The crowd was parting, bowing their heads not in reverence, but in primal submission. They were creating a path, and down it walked a figure that seemed to drain the very light from the gray sky. He was immense, broader and taller than any alpha she had ever seen. A thick, dark cloak trimmed with black wolf fur fell from his shoulders, and his heavy leather boots were silent on the cobblestones. Scars traced paths across the hard plains of his face, one particularly vicious line cutting from his temple, across his eye, and down to a jaw that looked as if it were carved from granite. His eyes, they were the color of a forest floor in deepest twilight, and they held no warmth, only a chilling absolute authority. This was King Davor Ryland, the Wolf King of the North, a ruler whose name was a curse and a legend. They said his own wolf was a ghost, silenced by a grief that had shattered his soul. They said no heir of his bloodline had ever lived to see their 20th winter, a curse that had haunted his family for generations, leaving him the last of his line. He was a king without a future, ruling a kingdom steeped in fear and shadow. He walked without haste, his gaze sweeping over the cowering alphas and trembling merchants until it landed on the auction block. On her. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, those twilight dark eyes met hers. There was no pity in them, no lust. There was something far more unnerving: recognition. As if he had been looking for her. The auctioneer began to tremble violently, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the stage. "Your Majesty, an unexpected honor. We are merely clearing out unwanted stock." Diver did not acknowledge him. His focus was entirely on Marianne. He stepped onto the block, his presence so immense it felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. The air crackled. Deep within her, in that place of dust and despair, her dormant wolf stirred. It was not a surge of strength, but a faint, terrified tremor, a spark of life answering a call it could not ignore. The king stopped directly in front of her. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and calloused, scarred from 100 battles. He did not touch her face or her body. He went straight for her chained wrist, his thumb tracing the raw, inflamed edges of her brand. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was not painful. It was awakening. It felt like the first breath after drowning. Her wolf whimpered, a soft, confused sound in the back of her mind. A low growl rumbled in the king's chest. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of a predator, a deep, possessive vibration that shook the very planks of the stage. The crowd flinched as one. That sound hadn't been heard from the king in a decade. It was the sound of his wolf, the beast they all thought was dead, and it was awake. It was claiming. King Deborah Ryland lifted her arm, the chains clinking softly, the brand held high for all to see. He turned, not to the auctioneer, but to the silent, staring assembly of his subjects, to the stunned elders and the scowling council members who had just begun to push their way to the front. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of mountains, an unbreakable command that echoed in the sudden, dead silence. "This is my queen." The words shattered the stillness. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Madness. The king was mad. To choose a barren Omega? A branded outcast? It was an insult to the sacred laws, a mockery of the traditions that held their world together. The council elders looked apoplectic, their faces turning shades of red and purple. One of them, a stern-faced alpha named Lord Vorlog, stepped forward. "Majesty, you cannot be serious," he protested, his voice tight with outrage. "She is broken, branded. She can never bear you an heir to break the curse." Davor's gaze remained locked on Marianne. It was as if no one else in the world existed. His thumb stroked her branded skin again, a strangely gentle gesture that sent another shiver through her. He was looking at her, into her, searching for something she didn't know she possessed. The fierce possessive light in his eyes intensified. He saw her shame, her worthlessness, her brokenness, and he was not deterred. He was satisfied. He finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement, and fixed Lord Vorlog with a stare so cold it could freeze blood. "The curse has broken every pure-blooded, fertile she-wolf we have offered it," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "The fates mock our strength. Perhaps they will answer to brokenness instead." He turned back to Marianne. He reached up with his free hand and gently cupped her jaw, tilting her face up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze fully. She saw the truth of the legends in his eyes, the profound aching loneliness, the weight of a dying bloodline. But she saw something else there now, something new and terrifyingly alive. A flicker of savage hope. His grip on her wrist was an unbreakable manacle of flesh and bone. He leaned in close, his breath a warm rush against her chilled skin, his scent of pine and winter overwhelming her senses. His lips were inches from her ear, his next words a secret whispered against a backdrop of rising chaos. A vow that sealed her fate and condemned them both. "They do not understand," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle directly into her soul. "You are not a curse. You are the answer." The world dissolved into a dizzying tunnel of sensation. The only anchor was the king's hand, a solid band of heat and strength around her wrist. He did not drag her, he simply walked, and the sheer force of his will compelled her to follow. The crowd scrambled back, a sea of fearful eyes and gaping mouths. The journey from the auction block to the great stone keep was a walk through a dream or a nightmare. Her bare feet, accustomed to dirt and straw, met the chillingly smooth flagstones of the citadel's causeway. The stench of the market faded behind them, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of mountain air and the cold perfume of old stone and power. Her chains, which had been a symbol of her lowly status, now felt like an obscenity in this place of silent reverence, their soft clinking a vulgar announcement of her origins. Guards in black iron armor, their helms shaped like snarling wolves, flanked the massive oak doors. They did not look at her, their gazes fixed forward, but she felt their contempt like a physical force. She was a piece of filth dragged into their sanctuary. The doors swung open without a sound, revealing a hall so vast it seemed to steal the sky. Torches burned in iron sconces, their flames casting dancing shadows on tapestries that depicted epic hunts and ancient battles. The air inside was still and heavy, echoing with the silence of generations. A queen in rags, a wolf without a voice. She was a discordant note in this symphony of power. Servants appeared from the shadows, their movements silent and practiced. They bowed low to their king, but their eyes, when they flickered toward Marianne, were filled with a mixture of horror and disdain. A woman, her hair streaked with gray and pulled into a severe knot, stepped forward. Her dress was simple but impeccably made, and she held herself with the authority of one who ran this silent, formidable household. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion, "your chambers are prepared." Her eyes swept over Marianne, taking in the matted hair, the torn tunic, the mud-caked feet, and the raw, weeping brand. A flicker of disgust crossed her face before it was smoothed back into a mask of professional indifference. "Shall I have the Omega taken to the servants' baths?" Davor stopped. He turned his head slowly to look at the woman. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Her name is Marianne Alara. She is your queen. You will prepare my bathing chamber. For her, you will bring salves for her wound, and you will bring the finest silks in this keep. Do it now." The command was absolute. The woman, Alara, paled visibly. For a moment she looked as if she might argue, a flash of rebellion in her stern eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, extinguished by the sheer unyielding weight of his authority. "As you command, your Majesty." She bowed again, a gesture far deeper and more submissive this time, before turning on her heel and issuing a series of sharp, whispered orders to the other servants. Davor led Marianne up a wide, winding staircase, his grip on her wrist never faltering. The stone beneath her feet was so cold it felt like walking on ice. They passed ancestral portraits, generations of grim-faced alphas, and their proud, beautiful mates staring down at her with accusing eyes. They were the fertile, the pure-blooded, the ones who had upheld the strength of the Reelan line until it had started to rot from within. She was an affront to their memory. The royal chambers were breathtaking and terrifying. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough for a man to stand in, casting a warm, golden glow over the cavernous room. A massive bed carved from dark wood and piled high with furs dominated one wall. Intricate silver carvings of wolves and moons adorned every surface. Yet, for all its warmth and grandeur, the room felt empty. It held the deep, pervasive chill of loneliness. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum for a dying dynasty. He finally released her wrist in the center of the room. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely untethered, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. The brand on her wrist throbbed, a constant, fiery reminder. Davor walked to the fire, staring into the flames, his broad back to her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She stood frozen, a statue of mud and misery in a palace of stone and sorrow. What was she supposed to do? What did he want from her? Servants entered, their movements swift and silent, their eyes averted. They carried buckets of steaming water, pouring them into a large copper tub that sat in an alcove near the fire. The scent of lavender and chamomile filled the air, a fragrance so clean and gentle it made Marianne want to weep. They laid out thick towels, a soft wool robe, and a gown of shimmering midnight blue silk. Alara herself placed a small porcelain jar of salve and clean bandages on a nearby table. They worked with a tense, resentful efficiency, and then they were gone, melting back into the shadows of the keep, leaving her alone with the king once more. "The bath is ready," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't seem to require him to turn around. Marianne didn't move. The tub, the steam, the silk, it was all for a life that wasn't hers. She felt like a stray dog being offered a feast it knew was poisoned. To accept this was to accept the impossible reality of his claim. To be a queen, her, the broken Omega? It was a cruel joke. Davor finally turned from the fire. His twilight eyes studied her, taking in her fear, her defiance, her utter confusion. He walked toward her, and her heart hammered against her ribs. He stopped before her and held out his hand, palm up. It was not a request. It was a command. Trembling, she placed her chained hands into his. He didn't lead her to the bath. Instead, he simply held her wrists, his gaze fixed on the crude iron links that bound her. With his other hand, he gripped one of the links. There was a faint grunt of effort, a sharp, metallic crack, and the chain fell apart in his hand. He tossed the broken pieces onto the stone floor, where they landed with a final, clattering sigh. She was free, but the brand remained. "Take off the rags, Cog," he said, his voice rough. A tremor of pure terror went through her. This was it, the price of his rescue. She was still just an Omega, a thing to be used, only now by a king instead of a rogue. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, but nothing happened. When she dared to open them again, he had not moved closer. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone and shadow. "The water grows cold," he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. He turned his back to her, a gesture of feigned privacy that was somehow more commanding than a stare, and returned to his vigil by the fire. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the coarse ties of her tunic. The rough fabric scraped against her skin. A familiar discomfort she was suddenly desperate to be rid of. The garment fell away, leaving her exposed and shivering in the heated air of the room. She slid into the bath, the water a shocking, blissful heat that enveloped her entirely. It was so deep she could sink down until it covered her shoulders, hiding her from his sight. She scrubbed at her skin, trying to wash away not just the grime of the market, but the stench of humiliation, the phantom touch of the auctioneer, the lingering scent of her own fear. The water swirled with dirt, a murky testament to the life she had just left behind. She stayed submerged for a long time, until the water began to cool, and the firelight flickered against her closed eyelids. She almost managed to believe she was alone, that this was just a dream she would soon wake from. "Let me see your wrist." His voice was right beside her. Her eyes flew open. He was kneeling on the stone floor beside the tub, the firelight catching the silver in his dark hair and illuminating the scars on his face. He held the jar of salve. Her heart leaped into her throat. He had moved so silently, a predator in his own domain. She slowly, hesitantly, lifted her arm from the water. The brand was an angry red welt against her now clean skin, the edges swollen and puckered. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they dwarfed hers completely. He dipped 2 fingers into the cool, fragrant salve and began to apply it to the wound. His movements were slow, deliberate, and incredibly careful. He wasn't just treating a wound, he was tending to it, an act of care so foreign it made her entire body tense. The salve soothed the burning pain, replacing it with a cool tingle. She watched him, mesmerized by the strange intimacy of the moment. His face, in concentration, lost some of its harshness. She could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the deep-set sorrow that seemed carved into his very bones. Why? Why was he doing this? Why choose her, the one wolf in the world guaranteed to be useless to him? As if he could hear her thoughts, he spoke, his voice a low rasp that was barely audible over the crackling of the logs on the fire. "The curse is a hunter," he murmured, his gaze fixed on her brand. "For generations it has hunted my bloodline. It waits for a child to be conceived, a new vessel for the royal blood, and then it latches on, poisoning the womb, withering the life within before it can take its first breath." He smoothed the salve over the jagged line that bisected the empty circle of her brand. His thumb pressed into the center of the angry symbol, and a strange, deep warmth pulsed from his touch, a hum of power she had never felt before, stealing her breath. It was not his own power, but something dormant inside her, answering his. Her wolf, so long silent, lifted its head in the depths of her soul, sniffing the air with a dawning curiosity. Davor's eyes, dark and intense, lifted from her wrist to meet hers. They glowed with a feral light in the steam-filled air, a flicker of something she could only describe as grim, desperate triumph. "It will see only this," he rasped, his thumb stroking the brand that had been the source of all her shame. "And it will be blind." The words hung in the steam between them, more shocking than his claim in the market square. "You are the answer." He saw her not as a woman, but as a key, a shield, a loophole in a divine contract written in blood and tears. The warmth from the bathwater turned clammy against her skin. She was a tool, chosen for her defect. The shame she had carried her whole life had not been erased. It had simply been repurposed. He withdrew his hand, and the strange, warm pulse that had resonated from her brand faded with his touch. The connection was broken, leaving her feeling hollow and cold. Davor rose to his full, intimidating height, once again the unreadable, monolithic king. The brief moment of intimacy, of shared vulnerability by the fireside, was gone as if it had never happened. He was a storm cloud that had momentarily parted to reveal a flicker of lightning, only to close again, darker than before. "Get dressed," he commanded, his back already to her. "The council will want to see the king's choice." The word hung in the air, laced with a cold irony that did not escape her. Marianne moved as if in a trance, her limbs heavy. She stepped from the tub, the cool air raising goosebumps on her skin. The servants had left a simple linen underdress and the gown of midnight silk. The linen was softer than anything she had ever worn. But the silk, it was like touching moonlight. It slithered over her skin, cool and impossibly smooth, pooling at her feet. In the flickering firelight, the fabric seemed to drink the shadows, shimmering with a life of its own. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of a silver water pitcher. A stranger stared back, a pale, wide-eyed wraith draped in riches, her face a mask of shock, her wrist wrapped in a clean white bandage that could not hide the truth of the brand beneath. A queen of ashes, dressed for a ball she never wished to attend. Her wolf, awakened but wary, paced the confines of her mind. It felt the king's power in the very stones of this keep. A low, constant hum that was both a threat and a strange sort of promise. It did not trust him, but it recognized his strength, and in their world, strength was the only thing that mattered. For the first time in years, it wasn't cowering. It was watching, waiting. Davor was waiting by the door, his dark cloak settled over his massive shoulders. He didn't look at her as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every hesitant step. He opened the heavy door and led her into the torchlit corridor. This time there were guards, 2 of them falling into step behind her. She was not a companion, she was a prisoner being escorted. The council chamber was at the heart of the keep, a place of cold stone and colder judgment. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scents of old parchment, beeswax, and the sharp, anxious tang of powerful alphas. As they approached the carved stone archway of the entrance, she could hear the voices from within, a low, angry murmur like the growling of a pack before a fight. "An abomination, he spits on the ancestors. Desperation has made him mad. The curse has finally claimed his reason. A barren Omega, we will be the laughingstock of the 5 kingdoms." That voice was Lord Vorlog's, sharp and venomous. Davor paused just outside the archway. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon her. "Do not speak unless I command it. Do not look at them. Look only at me." His voice was low, a vibration against her ear. "Your survival in this room depends on it." Then he strode into the chamber, and the murmuring choked into an abrupt, hostile silence. Marianne followed a step behind him, her eyes fixed on the formidable expanse of his back. She could feel the stares of a dozen powerful wolves boring into her, stripping her bare, judging her, dismissing her. The room was circular, with a great round table of polished obsidian at its center. Seated around it were the alphas of the most powerful clans sworn to the king, their faces grim, their postures radiating aggression. Lord Vorlog sat directly opposite the king's empty throne-like chair, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table's surface. Davor did not take his seat. He remained standing, a towering pillar of silent authority, forcing them all to look up at him. He was their king, and he was reminding them of it. He gestured for Marianne to stand beside him, a public declaration of her place at his side. The air in the room crackled with unspoken challenges. "You wished for an audience, my lords," Davor said, his voice deceptively calm. "I have granted it." Vorlog rose slowly from his chair, his eyes, the color of chips of ice, fixed on Marianne. "We do not wish for an audience, Your Majesty. We wish for an explanation, for this mockery." He spat the last word, his contempt a physical blow. "You shame your bloodline. You shame this council. You shame our laws. You bring a worthless barren Omega into the heart of this keep, and call her queen. Have you forgotten the price of the curse? It demands a strong heir, a pure vessel, not this." His gaze raked over her, and she fought the instinct to shrink away, remembering Davor's command. She kept her eyes on the king's profile, on the hard line of his jaw, the grim set of his mouth. "I have forgotten nothing, Vorlog," Davor replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, glacial tone. "I remember everything. I remember Lady Annalise, your own cousin, chosen for her pure bloodline, withering away in my bed, her womb turned to a cradle of poison. I remember Lady Alara from the Sunwood Pack, whose fertility was legendary, bleeding out before the first moon had passed. I remember the 6 mates before them, 6 strong, pure-blooded, fertile she-wolves, all chosen by this council, all fed to the curse, all dead." A pall of grim silence fell over the room. He was speaking of truths they preferred to forget, of failures they had all been complicit in. "Your methods have failed," Davor continued, his voice resonating with cold finality. "Your traditions are a banquet that has only succeeded in feeding our demise. I will try a new way." An older alpha with a long gray beard and weary eyes spoke up, his voice more sorrowful than angry. "But how, my king? What new way can there be with one who is barren? It is a fool's errand." Davor finally turned his full attention to the council, his twilight eyes sweeping over them, pinning each one in place. "The curse is intelligent. It is a predator that has learned to hunt its prey. It seeks the scent of new life, the promise of a Ryland heir, and it strikes. It has grown strong, feasting on the fertility we have so readily offered it. We have been trying to fight a forest fire with kindling." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he reached out and took Marianne's bandaged wrist, lifting it for them to see. "This," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is a locked door. This is a cold hearth. This is a field of stone where it expects a fertile valley. The curse will come sniffing for a new vessel, and it will find nothing. It will pass her by. And in that moment of blindness, when the hunter is looking the other way, its magic will be vulnerable." Vorlog let out a harsh bark of a laugh. "Vulnerable? To what? Magic requires magic, Majesty, not just the absence of it. Your grief has curdled your senses. You are chasing a ghost story, a child's fantasy, while our bloodline turns to dust." "Enough!" The word was not shouted. It was a low, resonant growl that shook the very air. The king's power, tightly leashed until now, flooded the room. The torches flickered, and the alphas at the table physically recoiled, their own wolves whining in submission. Davor's wolf was awake, and it was radiating a killing intent. "You will address your queen with respect, and you will listen." The shift in the room was palpable. The aggression turned to fear. They were all powerful alphas, but he was the alpha of alphas. A king forged in war and loss, with nothing left to lose. He lowered Marianne's arm, but did not release her. His thumb found her pulse point, a steady, reassuring pressure against her skin. "I have not brought her here to bear me a child in the conventional way," he said, his voice returning to its cold, measured calm. The council stared, confused. "I have brought her here to break the curse itself. Once it is broken, my blood will be my own again." The implication was clear. Once he was free, he could find another mate, a fertile one, to bear the heir. Marianne's heart clenched. It was exactly as she had suspected. She was the weapon, not the prize, a means to an end. Once her purpose was served, she would be cast aside just as her old pack had cast her aside. The silk on her skin suddenly felt like a shroud. Vorlog, though clearly shaken, was not defeated. "And how do you propose to wield this weapon?" he sneered, his courage returning. "She has no power, no standing. The magic of this keep, the very bloodlines that hold this kingdom together, will not recognize her. She's nothing." She is what I say she is, Davor stated, and she will be recognized. He turned his gaze from the council and looked directly at Marianne. For the first time since they had entered the room, he truly looked at her. In the depths of his dark eyes, she saw not the cold king or the desperate strategist, but the wolf, primal, determined, and utterly relentless. He was staking his entire future, the future of his line, on this single, impossible gamble, and he would allow nothing and no one to stand in his way. He turned back to his stunned council. His voice rang out clear and unbreakable, a proclamation that sealed her fate far more permanently than the brand on her wrist. At the next full moon in 7 days' time, I will perform the blood rite. I will bind her to me, to my blood, and to the heart of this keep. She will be queen not only by my word, but by the old magic. The matter is not open for debate. A collective gasp went through the room. The blood rite was the most sacred, most binding union, a ritual not performed in centuries. It would tie her soul to his, her life force to his kingdom. Vorlog's face was a mask of pure fury, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Davor ignored them all. His gaze was locked with Marianne's, a silent, binding contract passing between them. She saw it then, the terrifying truth of her new reality. This gilded cage had teeth, and its door had just been slammed shut, locked, and barred. This wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a choice. It was a sentence, 7 days. The words echoed in the suffocating silence of her chambers, a countdown to a fate she did not understand and had not chosen. After the king's proclamation, the council had been dismissed. Their impotent rage a bitter scent left lingering in the air. Davor had led her back to the royal wing, the grip on her wrist now feeling less like a claim and more like the hold of a jailer. He left her at the door with a single chilling command: "Do not leave these rooms." Then he was gone, swallowed by the stone corridors, leaving her alone in the vast, echoing space that was to be her world. The days that followed were a blur of unnerving stillness. Servants came and went like ghosts, leaving trays of food she barely touched, stoking the fire, and laying out more of the impossibly fine gowns. Alara oversaw it all with a face of granite, her disapproval a silent, oppressive weight in the room. Marianne was a doll being dressed and fed, a specimen being prepared for an arcane experiment. She explored her gilded cage, her bare feet silent on the thick carpets. The rooms were opulent, filled with treasures that meant nothing to her. Books she couldn't read, silver mirrors that reflected a stranger's haunted face, a balcony that overlooked a sheer drop down the mountainside, a vista of endless, forbidding peaks. There was nowhere to run. Her wolf, however, was no longer silent. Freed from the constant, crushing oppression of her old pack, it was stretching, testing the edges of her mind. It paced restlessly, fueled by a nervous energy that was entirely new. It felt the king's presence even when he was absent, a low thrum of power that resonated through the keep. Her wolf was drawn to it, a moth to a devastatingly powerful flame, while her human half recoiled in terror. This duality was a new form of madness. One part of her longed to break down the door and flee into the wilderness. The other, the primal, instinctual part, wanted to find the source of that power, to understand the alpha who had claimed her. The bandage on her wrist was changed daily by a silent, grim-faced healer who never met her eyes. The wound was closing, the raw flesh knitting together, but the brand itself remained a stark, ugly symbol. Yet something strange was happening to it. It no longer burned with shame. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth had begun to emanate from the scar, a low hum of energy that intensified whenever she thought of the king. It was as if his touch, that night by the bath, had planted a seed of something within the wound, something that was slowly starting to awaken. On the 4th night, sleep would not come. The moon was waxing, a sliver of silver hanging in the ink-black sky outside her window. The keep was quieter than ever, settled into a deep listening hush. Marianne sat by the fire, wrapped in a woolen robe, tracing the outline of the brand through the bandage. The warmth was stronger tonight, a definite pulse against her fingertips. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge, she began to unwrap the linen dressing. The scar was no longer an angry red. The skin had healed to a pale silver, and the lines of the brand, the empty circle, the bisecting line, seemed etched into her flesh with shimmering metallic ink. As she stared, mesmerized, a soft, ethereal light began to emanate from the lines. It was a faint, silvery blue glow, the color of moonlight on frost. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a soft, living light that cast strange shadows on her hand. Her breath hitched. This was not normal. This was magic. The brand, a mark of her curse, was now a source of something else, something connected to him. Her wolf whined in the back of her mind, a sound of awe and confusion. What was happening to her? A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Her head snapped up, her senses instantly on high alert. The guards posted outside her door were as silent as the stone they stood upon. They never made a sound. This was someone else. The heavy bar on her door was slid back with a soft grating noise. The door swung open slowly, revealing not the imposing figure of the king, but the wiry, venomous frame of Lord Vorlog. He was flanked by 2 alphas from the council, their expressions hard and merciless. Ice flooded Marianne's veins. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively backing away toward the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trapped. "The king is a fool," Vorlog said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss as he stepped into the room, the other 2 blocking the doorway. "He consorts with spirits and omens while his kingdom needs a true heir. He sees a weapon in you. We see a contamination that must be cleansed." His cold eyes fell to her wrist, to the softly glowing brand she had failed to cover in her panic. His lip curled in a sneer of disgust. "So the madness has taken root. He has marked you with his own desperate magic. It changes nothing. You are still barren, still worthless, and you will not be the ruin of this kingdom." He took a step toward her. "The king is with the moon priestess, preparing for his ritual. He will not hear you scream." Primal fear, cold and absolute, seized her. Her wolf, for all its newfound restlessness, cowered. These were powerful, determined alphas. There was no escape. She was going to die here, in this beautiful room, a footnote in a story of a mad king. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow, a blur of motion, a sound like a thunderclap. Her eyes flew open. Davor stood in the doorway, a whirlwind of black fury. The 2 alphas who had been blocking the entrance now lay crumpled on the floor, unmoving. Vorlog spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The king had not been with the priestess. He had been close, waiting, watching. Davor's eyes were no longer the color of twilight. They were burning gold, the pure, feral light of his wolf fully unleashed. A low, guttural growl tore from his chest, a sound so profoundly predatory that it vibrated in Marianne's bones. This was not the cold, controlled king of the council chamber. This was the beast of legend. "You dare!" he snarled, each word a death sentence. He moved with a speed that was unnatural, crossing the room in 2 silent strides. He seized Vorlog by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. Vorlog's face turned a mottled purple, his hands clawing at the king's unyielding grip. You cannot, the council," he choked out. "The council will learn the price of treason," Davor growled. He looked past Vorlog, his glowing golden eyes locking with Marianne's. He saw her terror, and he saw her glowing wrist. His gaze fixed on the brand, and for a split second, the feral rage in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of dark, possessive confirmation. It was as if her glowing scar was the proof he had been waiting for. He turned his attention back to the gasping alpha in his grip. With a final, sickening crack of bone, he ended Lord Vorlog's defiance. The body dropped to the floor with a heavy, final thud. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged sound of Marianne's own breathing. Davor stood over the body, his chest heaving, the golden light slowly receding from his eyes, leaving the familiar twilight dark in its wake. The wolf was retreating, the king returning. He finally looked at Marianne, who was still pressed against the stone of the fireplace, trembling uncontrollably. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, a raw, instinctual reaction to the violence she had just witnessed. His face tightened, a flicker of something unreadable, regret, frustration, crossing his features. He stopped. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply looked at her, then down at her wrist, where the silvery blue light of her brand was now pulsing. pulsing with a steady, insistent rhythm, brighter than before. It was a beacon in the shadowed room, a living piece of magic that defied all logic. His gaze lifted back to her face, his eyes dark and intense, searching her as if trying to read the secrets of her soul. The air between them was thick with the scent of spilled blood and ozone, the aftermath of a storm of rage. "The bond is taking root," he said, his voice rough, raw from his growl. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a confirmation of his impossible theory. "Faster than I expected." He took another slow step toward her, his hand outstretched, not to comfort, but to claim. He reached for her wrist, his fingers hovering just above the glowing scar. "They thought you were a weakness," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive rumble that vibrated through her entire being. "They will learn you are my strength." His fingers brushed against the glowing lines of the brand. A jolt, 1,000 times stronger than the one she'd felt by the bath, arced between them. The light on her scar flared, brilliant and white, and in that blinding flash, she felt it, a connection, a sudden, shocking awareness of him, of his wolf, of the ancient, aching sorrow that lived inside him. And in the same instant, she knew he felt her fear, her loneliness, her own broken soul. The light faded, leaving them in the fire-lit gloom, his hand now firmly clasped around her wrist, covering the brand that was no longer just a scar. It was a bridge, it was a lock, and he held the key. The jolt of connection left Marianne breathless, her mind reeling. For a split second, she had been inside his head, privy to a maelstrom of grief, rage, and a loneliness so profound it was like a physical place, a vast frozen landscape under a starless sky. The brief, shocking intimacy was more terrifying than Vorlog's attack. To be seen so completely, to have the tattered remnants of her soul laid bare, was an entirely new kind of violation. She tried to pull her hand back, but his grip was like iron. Davor's expression was grim, his jaw tight. He too had felt the surge, the uninvited glimpse into her own quiet despair. The shared moment had not softened him. It seemed to have hardened his resolve. This was working. His insane gamble was paying off, and the cost of it, her fear, her privacy, was irrelevant. "The right must be moved forward," he said, his voice clipped and decisive. "The council will be fractured. The loyal will stand with me. The treacherous will see Vorlog's fate and be forced into the shadows. We will use their fear. The full moon is in 3 days. We will do it then." He released her abruptly and turned away, striding to the door. "Guards!" he bellowed into the corridor. 2 new guards, their faces pale and set, appeared instantly, their eyes flicking nervously from their king to the bodies on the floor and back again. "Dispose of this carrion. Double the watch. No one enters these chambers but me. No one." The guards dragged the bodies away, leaving behind only a few dark, glistening streaks on the stone floor. Davor stood in the doorway, a formidable silhouette against the torchlight. He looked back at Marianne, who was still trying to still the frantic beating of her heart. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you will meet with the Moon Priestess. She will prepare you." He was gone before she could even form a question. Prepare her for what? For the rite, of course, but the word felt ominous, heavy with unspoken meaning. She was no longer just a shield. She was part of a ceremony, a ritual she knew nothing about. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the fine silk of the coverlet cold against her skin. She stared at her wrist. The glow had faded, but the warmth remained, a constant living pulse beneath her skin. She was changing, this place, this king, this magic. It was rewriting her, turning her into something she didn't recognize. And she was terrified. Dawn arrived not as a gentle light, but as a harsh gray wash that bleached the color from her opulent prison. True to the king's word, Alara appeared at her door, her face even more severe than usual. The news of Vorlog's death had clearly swept through the keep, and the fear it had engendered was a palpable thing. There was no more disdain in Alara's eyes, only a carefully masked terror. "The priestess is waiting," was all she said. Marianne was led not toward the grand halls of the keep, but down a narrow, winding staircase that seemed to descend into the very roots of the mountain. The air grew colder, damper, smelling of wet stone, earth, and something else. A faint herbal scent like dried leaves and burning sage. The torchlight gave way to the soft, silvery glow of luminous crystals embedded in the rock walls. They emerged into a circular cavern, the ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. In the center of the cavern, a pool of water, black and perfectly still, reflected the glowing crystals like a captured piece of the night sky. An old woman stood beside the pool. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair a long white braid that reached her waist. She wore simple undyed robes, and her eyes, when she turned them on Marianne, were a startling pale silver like the moon itself. They held a wisdom so old it was unsettling. This was the moon priestess. "Leave us," the old woman said, her voice a soft rustling sound like dry leaves. Alara bowed low and retreated up the stairs without a word. The priestess beckoned Marianne forward. "Come, child, let me see what the king has wrought." Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she approached the still water. The priestess took her hand, her own skin as cool and dry as parchment. She turned Marianne's wrist over, her silver eyes studying the branded scar. "Ah," she breathed, a sound of understanding and sorrow. Her thumb traced the glowing lines, but unlike the king's touch, hers produced no jolt of power, only a gentle, soothing warmth. "He is playing a dangerous game with the oldest of magics. He seeks to fool a curse by offering it a truth." "I don't understand," Marianne whispered, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vast cavern. "The Rylan curse is not just a poison, child. It is a sentient, hungry thing," the priestess explained, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing things Marianne could not. "It was born of a betrayal, a vow made to the moon goddess that was broken by the first Rylan king. He promised his love to a priestess of the moon, one of my ancestors, but cast her aside for a politically powerful mate. In her grief, the priestess cursed his line. As your love proved barren of truth, so shall your line be barren of future. The goddess, in her anger, gave the curse life. It clings to the royal blood, seeking out the spark of new life, the fertile ground where it can enact its vengeance, and turns it to dust." The story settled in Marianne's heart like a stone. It was a tale of a broken promise, of a woman scorned, a story not so different from her own. "The king believes that you, being barren, will not attract the curse's attention," the priestess continued, her silver eyes returning to Marianne's. "That your womb, being a place it cannot touch, will make it blind. He intends to use the blood rite to bind you to him so tightly that your condition shields his entire bloodline." "He told me," Marianne said quietly. "He said the curse would be vulnerable." The priestess's lips thinned. "Vulnerable, yes, but not for the reason he thinks. The king sees only strategy, a way to trick the magic. He does not understand the heart of it. The curse is not just looking for a womb to poison. It is looking for the echo of the original betrayal. It feeds on false promises and loveless unions." She paused, her gaze piercing. "For generations, the kings of this line have married for power, for alliances, for strong bloodlines. They have never married for the one thing that could appease the goddess, for a true heart bond." Marianne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold cavern. "And the king, and I, this is just another strategy, another loveless union." "Precisely, Baiki," the priestess confirmed. "He thinks he is offering the curse a shield. What he is truly offering it is a feast. The blood rite will bind you, yes, it will pour his magic, his blood, his very life force into you. And the curse, drawn by this immense surge of Rylan power, concentrated in a vessel of another loveless match, will come. It will come for him through you." The blood drained from Marianne's face. This wasn't a shield. It was a trap. And she was the bait. "It will kill him. It will try," the old woman corrected softly. "But the king's plan is not entirely without merit. Though he is blind to the true reason, the brand," she held up Marianne's wrist again, "this mark of shame, given to you by your pack, holds an echo of the first priestess's pain. This emptiness you carry, it mirrors her own barren future. The goddess will see her daughter's reflection in you." She led Marianne to the edge of the dark pool. "The blood rite is not just about him, child. It is about you. You must accept his blood, his magic. But you cannot do it as an empty vessel. You must have a power of your own to anchor it, or it will tear you apart from the inside before the curse even has a chance." "I have no power," Marianne whispered. the words a familiar, bitter truth. The priestess smiled, a faint, sad crinkling of her ancient eyes. Everyone has a power of some kind. Yours is simply sleeping. She gestured to the pool. The moon pool shows what is and what can be. The king sent you to me to be prepared for his ritual. I will prepare you for the truth of it. You must see for yourself what you are, what you will become when his blood enters yours. She took Marianne's other hand, the one without the brand, and pricked the tip of her finger with a small, sharp obsidian knife. A single drop of crimson blood welled up. The priestess guided her hand over the pool and let the drop fall. It hit the perfectly still surface without a ripple. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the black water began to shimmer. The drop of blood did not dissipate. It spread, creating swirling patterns of silver and deep indigo across the surface. The images resolved, showing her the auction block, the council chamber, Vorlog's death. Then the scene changed. It showed the rite, her kneeling before Davor, a silver chalice, a knife against his palm, his blood mixing with wine. And then she saw herself drink. The moment the blood touched her lips in the vision, the image in the pool exploded with light. She saw her own eyes, but they weren't her eyes anymore. They were glowing with the same silvery blue light as her brand. And behind her, a shadow took shape. A great silver wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, its eyes burning with intelligence and ancient power. It was her wolf, her true wolf, not the whimpering phantom, but a magnificent, powerful being that had been chained in the deepest part of her soul. The vision in the water was showing her the secret her body had kept for a lifetime. She wasn't barren because she was broken. She was barren because her human half could never contain the sheer power of her wolf spirit. It was too vast, too primal. A pregnancy, the creation of a new life, would have required a sharing of that power, a division that would have shattered her. Her barrenness wasn't a curse. It was a cage, built to contain a power she never knew she had. And the king's blood, the ancient Ryland magic, was the key that was about to unlock the door. The priestess's hand was a steady presence on her shoulder. "Now you see," she whispered. "The king thinks he is making you his shield. The goddess has other plans. She is making you his sword." The 3 days leading up to the full moon were a crucible of silence and anticipation. Marianne was returned to her chambers, but the gilded cage no longer felt like a prison. It was a cocoon. The vision in the moon pool had changed everything. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now threaded with something else, a terrifying, exhilarating sliver of hope. She was not nothing. She was a lock, waiting for a key. She spent the hours staring at her own reflection, searching for a sign of the great silver wolf she had seen in the water. She saw only her own pale face, her wide, haunted eyes, but she could feel it now. Deep within her, the sleeping giant was stirring, roused from its long slumber by the promise of the king's blood. Her senses, always dull and muted compared to other wolves, were sharpening. She could smell the ozone in the air that heralded a distant snowstorm, hear the faint cry of a hawk circling the highest peaks, feel the subtle shift in the keep's energy as the moon climbed toward its zenith. Davor did not visit her. She was left entirely to her solitude, a deliberate isolation designed, she suspected, to keep her untouched by the political turmoil still simmering below. Yet his presence was a constant, undeniable force. She felt him in the hum of the stones, in the restless pacing of her own nascent wolf. The bond, ignited by that brief, shocking touch, was a living thread between them, humming with a low, resonant frequency just beneath her skin. Through it, she could feel a muted echo of his own state, a tightly controlled anxiety, a grim determination, the crushing weight of a king staking his entire world on a single throw of the dice. On the third night, the moon rose, full and luminous, a perfect, chilling disk of silver in a black velvet sky. It flooded her chambers with an ethereal light, so bright it washed out the flames in the hearth. Alara and 2 other servants arrived, their faces solemn and unreadable. They did not speak. They moved with the silent, practiced grace of those performing a sacred duty. They bathed her not in scented water, but in a mixture of milk and herbs, yarrow, sage, and moon petal, that left her skin tingling and strangely energized. They dressed her in a simple, sleeveless gown of pure white silk that fell to the floor in a soft, whispering column. Her hair was unbraided, brushed until it fell like a dark curtain down her back. They left her unbound wrists bare, the silvery, healed brand a stark declaration on her skin. She was being prepared not as a bride, but as a sacrifice. When they were finished, Diavor entered the room. He, too, was dressed for ritual. He wore no armor, no kingly cloak. He was dressed in simple black trousers and a loose-fitting black tunic, the attire of a warrior, not a monarch. In his hands he carried a silver chalice, intricately carved with wolves howling at a full moon. His face was a mask of granite, but his twilight eyes burned with a feverish intensity. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping from the crown of her head to the tips of her bare feet. And for the first time, she saw not just a strategist appraising his weapon, but a man seeing a woman. A flicker of something, awe perhaps, or a deep, primal recognition, crossed his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. The thread of their bond pulsed, and through it she felt a surge of his power, a raw, possessive energy that made her wolf stand at attention. He was claiming her now, before the magic, before the gods. "It is time," he said, his voice a low rumble. He led her from the room. The corridors were empty, the guards gone. The entire keep seemed to be holding its breath. He did not take her to the grand hall or the council chamber. He led her up, spiraling ever higher, to the very peak of the keep. The Alpha's Roost, a circular, open-air platform of polished black stone, exposed to the night sky. The full moon hung directly overhead, so close it felt as if she could reach out and touch it. Its light was a physical presence, cold and cleansing. A chill wind whipped around them, tearing at her silk gown and her hair. In the center of the platform, the moon priestess waited beside a low stone altar. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and the cold, clean smell of the mountain night. "The moon is at its apex," the priestess said, her voice carrying easily over the wind. "The goddess is watching." Davor led Marianne to the center of the circle, positioning her to face him before the altar. He handed the chalice to the priestess, who held it up to the moonlight as if an offering. "The rite is a vow," the priestess intoned, her silver eyes fixed on the king. "A sharing of blood, of soul, of fate. What is given cannot be reclaimed. What is bound cannot be broken. Do you understand the price, King Davor?" "I do," he answered, his voice unwavering, his gaze locked on Marianne. "And you, child?" the priestess asked, turning her ancient eyes to Marianne. "You are the vessel. His magic will pour into you. It will either make you whole or shatter you to dust. There is no turning back. Do you accept this path?" Marianne looked into Davor's dark, intense eyes. She saw the desperation there, the centuries of grief he carried for his line. But she also saw the reflection of her own vision from the pool. The great silver wolf. The power that was her birthright. This was her only path forward. To remain as she was, a broken thing, or to risk annihilation for the chance to become whole. "I accept," she whispered, her voice a thin thread in the wind. The priestess nodded slowly. She handed Davor a small, wickedly sharp obsidian knife. Without hesitation, Davor drew the blade across the palm of his left hand. Blood dark and rich, welled instantly, a stark crimson against his skin. He held his bleeding hand over the silver chalice, letting his life force drip into it. "The blood of the mountain, the blood of the king, offered freely," the priestess chanted. Davor held the chalice, now stained with his blood, out to Marianne. His eyes never left hers. This was the moment, the precipice. Her hand trembled as she reached out to take the cup. Her fingers brushed his, and the bond between them flared. A sudden searing heat. The chalice was cold and heavy in her hands. She could smell the metallic coppery scent of his blood, a primal aroma that called to the wolf within her. She lifted the chalice to her lips. She hesitated for a single heart-stopping second. Then she drank. The taste was of iron and power, of ancient stone and deep, abiding sorrow. The moment his blood touched her tongue, it was no longer a liquid. It was fire. A white-hot, magical fire that coursed through her veins, incinerating everything in its path. It was an agony beyond anything she had ever known, a feeling of being unmade, of her very cells being torn apart and rewritten. A scream tore from her throat, raw and animalistic. She dropped the chalice, which clattered on the stone floor, and collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing. "Hold fast, child," the priestess's voice was a distant echo. "Anchor it, do not let it consume you." But the power was too much. It was a flood, a tidal wave of pure, untamed magic, and she was drowning in it. It was searching for a home, a center, and finding none. It was going to tear her apart. Through the haze of pain, she saw Davor drop to his knees in front of her. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. "Marianne, look at me," he commanded, his voice a desperate roar against the storm inside her. She forced her eyes open. His face was a mask of strain, his own body trembling with the sympathetic backlash of the rite. He was feeling her pain, feeling her breaking, and in his eyes, she saw not a king, but a desperate, terrified male whose last hope was dying before his eyes. And then, something shifted. A low, ominous growl echoed across the platform, but it hadn't come from Davor. It came from the air around them. A shadow fell over the moon, a creeping darkness that blotted out the stars. The wind died, and a sudden unnatural cold descended, so intense it frosted the edges of the stone altar. "It is here," the priestess whispered, her voice tight with awe and fear. The curse. It manifested as a pressure, a malevolent presence that sought to crush the very life from the air. It was drawn by the raw, unbound power of the king's blood, and it had found its target. Marianne. It coiled around her, a serpent of pure spite, its invisible fangs seeking purchase in her soul. It sensed the chaos within her, the lack of an anchor, and it began to feed on it, amplifying her pain, pushing her toward the abyss. But the curse, in its ancient arrogance, made a mistake. In its haste to destroy the vessel, it pushed too hard. It bypassed the broken human girl and struck the cage deep within, and the cage shattered. A howl of pure, untamed power ripped from Marianne's soul, a sound that was both hers and not hers. The agony of the king's blood was suddenly dwarfed by a new, explosive sensation: freedom. The great silver wolf, chained for a lifetime, was loose. Her power, erupted from her, a shockwave of silvery blue energy that threw Davor back and sent the curse reeling. Her body arched, her bones cracking and reforming with blinding speed. The white silk of her gown tore away as her form elongated, shifted, grew. Silver fur, the color of moonlight on snow, sprouted from her skin. Her senses exploded. She could taste the minerals in the stone, smell the fear on the priestess, see every line of shock and disbelief on Davor's face as he stared at her transformation. She rose, not on 2 feet, but on 4 powerful paws. She was magnificent. Larger than any wolf she had ever seen. Larger even than Davor, in his shifted form, would be. Her eyes burned with a silvery blue light, the same color as the brand on her foreleg now, a glowing sigil of her new reality. She was not a broken Omega. She was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful. The shadow of the curse coalesced, taking on a form of swirling darkness, a predator recognizing a true threat. It lunged, but it was too slow. Marianne, in her true form, met it with a snarl that shook the mountaintop. This was her king's blood, her mate's magic, and she would not allow it to be tainted. She was the shield, she was the sword. She leaped, a silver blur of moonlight and fury, to meet the darkness head-on. The battle for the Ryland soul had begun. The clash was not of flesh and bone, but of will and essence. When Marianne's wolf form met the swirling darkness of the curse, there was no sound, only a concussive blast of opposing energies that threw shimmering waves of force across the rooftop. The curse was a being of pure spite, ancient and hungry. It tasted of betrayal, of cold tombs, and withered life. It fought with tendrils of despair, whispering images of her past into her mind. The sneering faces of her old pack, the sting of the branding iron, the loneliness of a life spent in the shadows. It sought to drown her in her own worthlessness, but it was attacking a ghost. The broken Omega was gone, burned away in the crucible of the king's blood. The great silver wolf that now stood in her place had no memory of shame, only a primal, crystalline certainty of its own power. The whispers of the curse were meaningless against the roar of her newfound soul. She met its despair with a wave of pure, unadulterated life force, the magic of her own awakened spirit, now bound to the potent, ancient blood of the Ryland kings. Davor watched, frozen in a state of profound shock. He was on his feet, his own wolf raging beneath his skin, desperate to shift and join the fight. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was not his battle. His power, the very blood that had unlocked her, was now a part of her. If he interfered, he would only disrupt the delicate, volatile balance. He saw the glowing silvery blue brand on her foreleg, a perfect mirror of the sigil that had once been her shame. It pulsed with a brilliant light, the focal point of her power, the anchor the moon priestess had spoken of. He had sought a shield and had, by some impossible twist of fate, forged a god-slaying weapon. The curse, realizing its psychological attacks were failing, changed tactics. It condensed, its shadowy form solidifying into a monstrous, wolf-like shape of roiling black smoke and malevolent red light. It was the curse's own beast, the avatar of its ancient hatred. It lunged, its smoky claws aiming for her throat, its jaws gaping to swallow her whole. Marianne did not retreat. She met its charge, a silver comet against a devouring void. Her teeth, now long and sharp as daggers, sank into the shadowy substance of the beast. It had no flesh, but it shrieked, a high, thin sound that scraped at the mind, the sound of pure magic being unraveled. Its form dissolved and recoiled, the wound she had inflicted glowing with her silver light, a cauterizing fire that the darkness could not extinguish. She could feel it now, the intricate weave of the curse. It was a parasitic magic, latched onto the very DNA of Davor's bloodline. And now, having consumed his blood, that bloodline ran through her. She was the host. But she was not a passive victim. She was a predator in her own right. She could feel the curse's anchor point, the knot of ancient, bitter magic that had sustained it for centuries. It was tied directly to the echo of the king's life force within her. To destroy the curse, she would have to tear a part of him from herself. The curse beast reformed, larger and more desperate. It knew she had found its weakness. It abandoned direct attacks and instead threw its full power at the bond between her and Davor. A wave of agonizing, icy pain shot through Marianne, originating from the brand on her leg. It was a poison, designed to sever the connection, to isolate her and leave her vulnerable. She cried out, stumbling back a step, the silver light of her fur flickering. Across the platform, Davor grunted in pain, clutching his chest. He could feel the attack as if it were on his own soul, a venomous chill spreading through his veins. "Marianne!" he yelled, his voice raw with a fear he had not felt in years. He saw her falter, saw the shadow beast gathering itself for a final killing blow. He could not stand by. Protocol be damned. He let his own wolf surge forward. His shift was not the explosive, elemental transformation hers had been. It was the practiced, brutal change of a seasoned warrior. Bones snapped, muscle tore, and reformed. In seconds, a massive black wolf stood where the king had been, its eyes burning with the golden light of a true alpha. He was huge, powerful, a creature born of battle and authority, but even he was dwarfed by the sheer scale and ethereal presence of the Silver Queen. He charged, a black thunderbolt, placing himself between Marianne and the curse. He met the shadow beast's next lunge with a snarl that was a promise of death, his physical strength a bulwark against the creature's magical assault. His intervention gave her the moment she needed. The pain from the curse's attack was intense, but with Davor now acting as a physical shield, she could focus her will inward. She reached into her own essence, following the icy thread of the curse's poison back to its source. She found it, a knot of tangled, corrupted magic wrapped around the core of Davor's blood gift. It was a cancerous growth on her soul. The moon priestess's words came back to her. What is given cannot be reclaimed. She couldn't expel his blood, but she could purify it. She made a choice. Gathering every ounce of her newfound power, she drove it into the brand on her leg. The silver-blue sigil erupted with light so bright it bleached all color from the world, forcing both the priestess and the human part of Davor's consciousness to shield their eyes. She was not attacking the curse. She was performing a radical act of self-sacrifice. She was burning her own blood. She offered up a single drop of her own life essence, her original, pre-ritual blood, into the roaring furnace of the king's magic within her. Her blood, the blood of a dormant but powerful line, was the catalyst. It was the offering the goddess had been waiting for, not just a true heart bond, but a willing sacrifice. A love not of romance, but of loyalty and shared fate, freely given. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The silver light that erupted from her was no longer just energy. It was a purifying flame. It surged through the bond to Davor, burning the last vestiges of the curse's poison from his soul. He felt a searing heat, then a sudden, incredible lightness, as if a weight he had carried his entire life had been lifted. The cursed beast, its connection to both of them severed, let out a final, agonizing shriek as the silver fire consumed it, turning its smoky form to harmless, glittering dust that was scattered by the wind. The great silver wolf that was Marianne stood panting in the center of the rooftop, the brilliant light slowly receding from her fur. The anchor of the curse, the knot of black magic within her, had been incinerated, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The battle was won. She turned her massive head, her luminous eyes finding the golden gaze of the black wolf beside her. A silent communication passed between them, deeper than any words. He saw his salvation in her. She saw her purpose in him. He had given her power. She had given him freedom. Slowly, painfully, her form began to recede. The shift back was not as violent, but it was draining. The magnificent wolf dissolved, leaving Marianne, human and naked, kneeling on the cold stone. She was trembling, utterly exhausted, the hollow ache in her soul a vast empty space. Davor too shifted back, his own movements weary. He rushed to her side, stripping off his tunic and wrapping it around her shivering form. He knelt before her, his hands framing her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the king, the warrior, the strategist were all gone. There was only the man, his soul stripped bare, his eyes filled with a raw, breathtaking reverence. He had been reborn, and the woman responsible was kneeling before him, trembling from the power she had just unleashed. "Marianne," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He didn't know what to do. His entire life had been defined by the curse. His every decision, his every cold action had been a move in a desperate game against an unbeatable foe. And now, in a single, impossible night, the game was over. He was free. And he owed it all to the broken Omega he had bought for a pittance. The moon priestess approached them, her ancient face serene in the clean moonlight. "The goddess is appeased," she said softly. "A true vow was made. A sacrifice was given. The bloodline is clean." Davor's gaze never left Marianne's. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently touching the brand on her wrist, which was no longer a scar or a sigil, but simply a part of her skin, pale and silver. The magic had settled, integrated. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. A shudder went through his powerful frame. It was the tremor of a mountain shedding a glacier it had carried for an eon. She could feel his relief, his disbelief, his overwhelming gratitude pouring through the bond between them, filling the hollow space the curse had left behind. "Mine," he murmured against her skin, the word not a claim of ownership, but a vow of utter, unbreakable devotion. "My queen." The first spring after the breaking of the curse arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with the triumphant roar of cracking ice in the rivers, and the scent of damp, rich earth awakening from a long, enforced slumber. For the first time in a century, the snows receded from the high peaks of the Ryland kingdom to reveal not just gray stone, but the stubborn green of new life. It felt to everyone like the world's first spring. The kingdom, so long held in a state of suspended, fearful winter by its king's affliction, was finally breathing again. Marianne stood on the balcony of their chambers, the one that had once seemed like the edge of a cliff. Now it was simply a place to watch the sunrise. A gentle breeze, carrying the sweet fragrance of pine and budding moon-petal flowers, toyed with the ends of her dark hair. She wore a simple gown of pale green, the color of new leaves, and the skin on her wrist was smooth and unblemished, the silver lines of the brand having faded into nothing more than a faint, shimmering memory, visible only in the strongest moonlight. A reminder not of shame, but of her becoming. The keep was no longer a place of echoing silence and fearful whispers. Laughter could be heard from the training yards below, and the council chamber, once a pit of vipers, was now a place of vigorous, hopeful debate. The lords who had stood with Vorlog had been dealt with, some exiled, some stripped of their titles, but Davor had been merciful. The victory had washed the bitterness from his soul, leaving in its place a calm, steady strength that radiated through his entire kingdom. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against a solid, warm chest. Davor rested his chin on her shoulder, his own gaze following hers to the sun-drenched valley below. He no longer wore the constant armor of a king bracing for tragedy. The harsh lines on his face had softened, and his twilight eyes, when they looked at her, held a universe of warmth and devotion. "You are thinking so loudly your thoughts are rattling the stone," he murmured, his voice a low, pleasant rumble against her ear. She smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "I was just remembering the market square." His arms tightened around her. He never liked to be reminded of that day, of the chains on her wrists and the mud on her skin. It was the one shadow that still haunted him, the proof of the world's blindness to the treasure he had almost overlooked. "That was a lifetime ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That woman is gone." "Not gone," Marianne corrected softly, placing her hand over his. "Just awake." The bond between them was no longer the volatile, humming thread it had been in the beginning. It had settled into a deep, quiet river of shared thoughts and emotions, a constant, comforting presence that was as natural as breathing. She felt his love for her not as a grand declaration, but as a steady, unwavering warmth at the core of her being. And he felt her own love in return, a fierce, protective loyalty that had been forged in moonlight and fire. Her wolf, the magnificent Silver Queen, was a part of her now, not a separate entity. It was the source of her confidence, the quiet hum of power beneath her skin. She had never shifted again since that night on the Alpha's roost. There had been no need, but she knew the power was there, sleeping peacefully, ready. Davor's wolf too was at peace, the ghost of its grief finally laid to rest, content to rest beside its mate. "The moon priestess sent word this morning," Davor said, changing the subject, his hand moving to rest gently on her abdomen. "She says the signs are favorable. The land is fertile again. The bloodline is fertile again." Marianne felt a familiar, gentle pang at his words. Though the curse was broken, the fundamental truth of her body remained. She was the queen who had saved the kingdom, but could not give it an heir. She had made her peace with it, and so, she thought, had Davor. He had never once spoken of seeking another mate, of fulfilling that part of his duty. His devotion to her had been absolute, but still, the thought of his ancient line ending with him was a quiet sorrow they both carried. "The kingdom is strong, Davor," she said gently. "It will survive even without a Reland pup to lead it. You have built a council, a legacy of law, that will endure." He was silent for a long moment. He turned her in his arms, his hands framing her face, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Marianne, my love, you misunderstand." His thumb stroked her cheek, his gaze searching hers. "The priestess was not speaking of the kingdom. She was speaking of you." Marianne's breath caught. "What are you talking about? I am as I have always been." "No," he said, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face, transforming him completely. "You are not the right. It did more than just break the curse and awaken your wolf. It bound us. It shared my blood, my magic, my very life force with you. And the sacrifice you made. You did not just burn the curse away. You purified my bloodline inside of you. You remade it." Understanding dawned, slow and unbelievable, a fragile sunrise in her heart. The hollowness she had felt after the battle, the space the curse had left behind, it had not remained empty. Over the past months, as the bond between them deepened from a magical pact to a true and profound love, that space had been filling. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a question she did not dare to speak. He answered it anyway, his voice thick with a joy so profound it was nearly holy. "The healers confirmed it this morning. The barren brand was a lie, Marianne. Not because you were broken, but because your body was waiting. It was waiting for a magic strong enough to house the spirit of your wolf. It was waiting for my blood. It was waiting for us." He lowered one of his large, calloused hands, pressing it flat against her womb with infinite gentleness. "The Ryland line will not end. Our line will begin." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. Tears not of sorrow or shame, but of a joy so complete it was overwhelming. The final, broken piece of her was made whole. She was not just a shield or a sword. She was not just a queen. She was the soil in which a new future, a future free of curses and born of love, would grow. She pressed her face into his chest, her tears soaking the fabric of his tunic, her quiet sobs shaking her entire frame. He held her, burying his face in her hair, his own control finally breaking. He was the Wolf King who had inherited a legacy of death, who had claimed a broken Omega in a final desperate gamble, and she was the barren queen who had bled her own soul to give him back his future. Together, in the light of the first true spring, they stood not as two halves made whole, but as a new and singular beginning, their love the foundation of a kingdom reborn.